So in this section, we're going to talk about security in MongoDB. And there are a lot of aspects to security, so we'll cover quite a few things here, I think. There is, for example, authentication, i.e. just authenticating or logging in and to the system. Then there's sort of access control. Once you're logged in, what are you allowed to do? Or authorization. There might be other things too, such as encryption. It's possible to run a MongoDB cluster using SSL and encryption for all of the communications to the cluster. There's also a third-party encryption at rest product available. There's more details on that on the website. And in fact, you probably want to take a look at the security documentation, which is over here at this location. Quite a bit of information there. Also important would be just your network setup, making sure the nodes are not accessible on the MongoDB ports from servers or clients that are not allowed to use the cluster. So locking it down, for example, so that it's not visible from the public internet, for example. And auditing might be of interest too. Some of these features are in the MongoDB open source project in addition. A couple of these features are in the Enterprise Edition, which is a non-free edition of MongoDB that's available via a subscription. In particular, auditing is something that is not free. And on authentication, there's a lot of different forms of authentication supported by MongoDB. First of all, there's the MongoDB sort of challenge response with usernames and passwords that are actually stored by the cluster, or the hashes are stored by the cluster. So that was the original authentication mechanism in the product. There's also authentication can be done using X509, in other words SSL style certificates and authentication. So if you're using the SSL, you could do it that way. And then in the Enterprise Edition, one can do Kerberos or LDAP. So the items with the star are in the Enterprise Edition only. By default, when you run a MongoD or MongoS process, security is off. In other words, it's assumed it's running in a trusted environment, much like you would do with something like Memcached, for example. So to turn on the security facilities, and if you're going to be using all of that, you're going to put on the command line --auth. There may be other parameters too, and this could also be in the config file for the MongoD if you're using that. And this would also apply to MongoS in a similar way. Processes. So that's the basic thing to turn on the security, and then we're going to then set all the other settings depending on their various flavors of authentication we want and other things like that, for example. So we'll go through a couple of examples and look at that. All right, so what we're going to do now is we'll start up a MongoD with some security on and set it up. So I'll start with a blank database. So I'm just going to run like this, but I'm going to specify the auth parameter also. Okay, it looks like it's up and running. So now I'm going to go over and connect to that with the Mongo shell, and it let me connect. So the reason it let me connect, it will let me connect on localhost because there's no authentication configured yet for the cluster. So this is for initial setup. It'll let me in. Once that's set up, it won't let me in without a username and a password. So our context currently is the test database, so we could try something like this. And that's all well and good because we haven't created any users or roles yet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to the admin database. So the admin database is a reserved name for database names, and it's a special database which includes the users and roles for administrators. So what happens is there'll be a database name .system.users collection for database, which has the usernames and roles of the users for that database. The admin database is special though, and it is used for accounts and roles that are cluster-wide or server-wide, if you want to think of it that way. So now let's go back to the shell. And so I'm switching to that database. And I'm going to use the, there's some helpers in the MongoDB shell to do some of these security things for us. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the kind of traditional challenge response MongoDB authentication, which means that I'm going to supply a username and a password, And then MongoDB is going to use its own wire protocol handshakes for logging in. So I'm going to use this. I'm not using the SSL authentication. I'm not using the Kerberos support or any of that stuff here. So that's what I'm going to demo. It's just your basic internal authentication that's built right into the product when --auth is on. So let's do that now. So first I'll make a user object. And this is just in the shell, which is JavaScript. The server hasn't done anything yet. I just wanted to get that set up first. Of course, there's a very weak password. Super weak. Don't do that in the real world. And then you'll see here this list of roles. If you go back over to the web pages for security, you'll find in the documentation list of all the roles. So here I'm giving myself the user admin any database role so that I can administer. Because once a user is created, then this sort of login from localhost without authenticating privilege will be revoked for forever. So there is a helper, db.createUser in the shell. If you type db.help, you'll see those top level helper methods here, and create user. There's the one we're interested in at the moment. My database is admin. Okay, so that looks good. Now if I type show DBs or anything, so I'm not authorized because I haven't authenticated as that user we just created yet. So I'm going to go do that now. Okay, so now we're going to reconnect. I'm going to connect in the context of the admin database using this username and password we'd set up. Probably better to do this and then type in the password like this. And now we're here. You can see our databases, and our current database is admin. So the user we created had the role user admin any database, so it has basically privileges to do administration, but it doesn't have privileges to do reading or writing to a database. So I'm going to make another user now who has such privileges. Okay, so now we've created that user. So now if we go in with that username, so now we can run this show collections command because that's actually a query. Basically, that's going to do something like this and make it print out prettily, but that's what it's doing behind the scenes, the show collections helper. So we can do that now, right? And then you can see the various collections that are present. And once again, we're in, as you can see here, it's the admin DB. So we could take a look at the user's collection, see what's in there. And you see it's locked down. But that's where the user documents are stored, and the message digests of the password and other things, so that we can do the challenge response authentication. I'm now going to switch to the test database, and with this user Will that we're using currently, I can query this database, and I can write to it also. We gave the role read write any database to Will, and the place to do that was over under admin DB. So I can also write here, and so that's working. We might now want to create a new user, and I'm going to pick another database name and make a user. So this user is going to have read-write permissions. The one we just have been using recently, Will, has read-write any database. This one is simply read-write of the current database, or the one that the user object exists in. So we will now create that user. And what we're going to see here is that this is not going to be permitted. And that's because we're logged in as Will, and Will has the role read-write any database, but doesn't have administrative permissions. So now I'm going to go back to, I'm going to log out, I'm going to go back to this login, which did have those permissions. So now use test db2. So now it's permitted. And of course, you may want to have a user who has multiple roles that can maybe read every database and administer. That's up to you and how you want to set up your sort of security authorizations kind of and roles strategies. So we now have added this user who has permissions for a specific database. So let's exit and actually log in as that user. And what I need to do is actually need to go to the correct database when I do this, since they only have access to one database. So here we are, and we can insert some data here, and we can read the data. However, if I try to switch over to the test database, I'm not going to have any access because my access was only given to one specific database for this user. So give a quick summary of some of the standard roles that are available from version 2.6 and above MongoDB. In our little example we just did, we used 3 different ones. Let's go through what are some of the other ones. First of all, there's read, read-write, DB admin, user admin, cluster admin, read any database, read-write any database, user admin any database, and DB admin any database. So these are the common roles. It's possible to have more than one, right? You might be able to read, write, and do DB admin and user admin, for example, right? And it could either be in the context of a specific database or for basically all databases on the system in question. The cluster admin role basically gives one authorization to use the cluster-related MongoDB commands that have to do with administrating cluster, such as adding a shard and managing replica sets and those sort of things. And you can find out more on the roles over in the documentation. You can go more granular than this actually, if you need to. So on this page, we can see information on the built-in roles, and there's some that are more granular that roll up to these ones we've been talking about. You can also create custom or user-defined roles. So if you want to check that out, just look at the documentation. I think it would often that won't be necessary, but that would be where you really want to specify very precisely what commands a role can run. So for example, the regular old read role means that you can read for the database in question non-system collections and these system collections. In addition, these commands are allowed. Find being a query, not a command per se, perhaps. Okay. One other note is that most of this authorization stuff here is new in version 2.6 and above of MongoDB. So before version 2.6, let's say in version 2.4, the roles were very simple. So to use these things, you'll want to get and use 2.6 and above. One further note, we talked about using --auth on the command line. In addition, when you're working with a sharded cluster or a replica set, you will use another parameter called keyfile. And this is to tell the processes making up the cluster, the MongoDB and MongoS processes, how to authenticate among themselves intra-cluster. So this file would contain a shared secret key that all members of the cluster have available to them to cross-authenticate among themselves so that they can coordinate their actions. If you use keyfile, it implies auth, but I would recommend that you list both out explicitly in your config file or your command line so that it's clear that auth is in effect. It's also possible with the Enterprise Edition to use X509 authentication intra-cluster for the internal cluster authentication if you're using that edition and using X509. And you can find a little bit more information on that on this page in the documentation.